Hi, this is Dr. Mary Kathleen Figueroa coming to you from the Thyroid Channel, and today we'll be discussing, do you have Hashimoto's thyroiditis or do you just have hypothyroidism? So often patients will come to me having had hypothyroidism for many years and not know whether they have Hashimoto's thyroiditis or not. Well, let me just tell you right up front, if you have hypothyroidism and you were not first hyperthyroid or your thyroid wasn't taken out surgically, you have at least an 85% chance of having Hashimoto's thyroiditis as the cause of your hypothyroidism. Many years ago, the US government decided to promulgate that salt should contain iodine because in many areas of the United States, if you live in the United States, there was low iodine in the soil and people did not eat fish. So they ran with iodine deficiency, and that alone would cause their thyroid to grow in size, and they develop goiters or enlarged thyroids. Well, since most salt in the US has been iodized, the main cause of hypothyroidism has been Hashimoto's thyroiditis, unless proven otherwise. So if you've been having hypothyroidism for years but you did not know why, the major reason that you would have hypothyroidism would be Hashimoto's thyroiditis. So what happens if your antibodies are taken and the antibodies are normal? Still, you have a high chance of having Hashimoto's thyroiditis. The reason why you have Hashimoto's, and I've discussed this in a prior video, is that your body has made antibodies to your own thyroid, which is part of you. It should not make antibodies to part of you, but if it does, then you have an autoimmune disorder. And Hashimoto's thyroiditis is the #1 endocrine autoimmune disorder in the United States. So if you have Hashimoto's thyroiditis and your antibodies are negative, that does not mean that you don't have Hashimoto's thyroiditis. You can still have significant immune problems without having positive antibodies in the blood. More indicative would be if you had an ultrasound of your thyroid, which is not necessary for Hashimoto's, but if you had an ultrasound and you saw pop marks, you saw places where parts of your thyroid had been taken out, looking more like a sponge or looking like a cloudy sky than the sheet of whiteness you should see in a normal thyroid, that would be more indicative. And even more indicative would be if you had a biopsy of the thyroid and there were macrophages and other lymphocytes seen in your thyroid, then that would mean that you had Hashimoto's thyroiditis, which is just the name given to lymphocytic thyroiditis, which means that you have lymphocytes in your thyroid because your immune system brought them there and they shouldn't be there. So 85% chance of having Hashimoto's thyroiditis if you have hypothyroidism. But does that mean, so secondly now, does that mean you'll have other problems, right? Now you've discussed with your endocrinologist, you found that you really do have Hashimoto's thyroiditis, whether your antibodies are positive or negative. Will you have other problems? The underlying mechanism of Hashimoto's thyroiditis is autoimmunity, as we discussed, and that comes from the type of white blood cells you make. You inherited those from your parents and their parents. So if you have a certain type of white blood cell type, you are more likely to have Hashimoto's thyroiditis, but you are also more likely to have other diseases that are autoimmune. Not all autoimmune diseases are related, but there are several that are related to hypothyroidism. Among them are type 1 diabetes. Secondarily, other members of your family having Graves' disease or also having Hashimoto's thyroiditis, lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, and in some people, celiac. So those are similar traits that go together. They don't one cause the other. Some are more common than others. So that hypothyroidism and Hashimoto's thyroiditis is way more common than type 1 diabetes and way more common than lupus, thankfully. But those other problems can come in because they are related immunologically to the same type of HLA, human leukocyte antigen antibody, that gave you the tendency to have hypothyroidism. And then thirdly, since I mentioned the word celiac, will you have problems with gluten if you have hypothyroidism? Well, studies since 2009, 2008 were the first studies, suggest that you are at much higher risk of having a problem with gluten if you have hypothyroidism than the average American. The rates of celiac in the general population in the US are between 1 in 100 or 1 in 133, so really uncommon. The rates in people who have thyroid disease, either Graves' disease or Hashimoto's thyroiditis, are up to 10 to 15%. So that still isn't super likely, because that's 1 in 10, going towards 1 in 5 chance, but it is far higher than the rest of the population. And so if you've been told by your endocrinologist that lower gluten might be a good idea for your Hashimoto's thyroiditis, because you're just beginning, you have a thyroid that hurts, so you have pain, you have some achiness, you have brain fog, you have joint problems. So if you have any of those problems and you've been told to try lowering gluten, the reason you're being told to try lower your gluten is that there's at least a 15% chance, or 15 to 20% chance, that you might have problems with gluten. The rest of the time, 80% of the time, you have absolutely no problems with gluten and it doesn't figure into your disease. But if you were to try to lower that in your diet and you felt objectively better, you were to report and record how you felt before you started to lower your gluten and after you started to lower your gluten, or you had some IBS symptoms, some irritable bowel syndrome, and then you found that those symptoms got better after you stopped taking gluten, then you'd be reassured that you had stopped taking something that was making your immune system more active. And to the degree that you have any control over the progression of your hypothyroidism, then you would have slowed down its progression. So again, most hypothyroidism is Hashimoto's thyroiditis. If you have Hashimoto's thyroiditis, you may or may not have positive antibodies, depending on where you are in the process of having hypothyroidism. And having that autoimmunity makes you at higher risk for other disorders, but they are way less common than hypothyroidism. And lastly, you may have a problem with gluten, and that may be related to the same autoimmunity and the same HLA subtype, the DRDQ subtype, that makes you at higher risk for Hashimoto's thyroiditis. If you've enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you'd like to subscribe, please subscribe below.